Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The radio crackled with static before Sarah's voice cut through, tight with something James hadn't heard from the veteran dispatcher in 15 years. Ranger Coleman, we need you at the North Trail coordination point, now. James pressed the transmit button, his weathered hand steady despite the tone in Sarah's voice. Copy that. What's the situation? A pause. Too long. Another hiker didn't check out. 26-year-old female. Mia Brennan. She's 4 days overdue. 4 days. James felt something cold settle in his stomach as he guided his truck along the rutted Forest Service road. Lodgepole pines crowding close on both sides like skeletal witnesses. 4 days meant the window was closing. 4 days in the Adirondack backcountry in October meant exposure, hypothermia, bears preparing for winter. 4 days meant a recovery operation, not a rescue. But that wasn't what made his hands grip the steering wheel harder than necessary. 4 days was exactly how long the others had been missing before they stopped looking. Tyler Marsh, the backpacker from Boston, gone in late August, 4 days past his checkout date before his family raised the alarm. Before that, in June, a local trail guide named David Whitmore, 4 days. And in April, a wildlife photographer, Jennifer Costa, 4 days. The pattern sat in James's mind like a stone, heavy and undeniable. He'd mentioned it to Chief Ranger Morrison after Tyler disappeared, pointing out the timing, the similar profiles. All experienced outdoors people who knew what they were doing. Morrison had looked at him with something between pity and concern, the same look everyone gave James since Rachel died. People get lost, Coleman. Sometimes they don't want to be found. Don't go looking for patterns that aren't there. But James had spent 3 years looking for patterns in the woods ever since he transferred here from Colorado, running from memories that followed him anyway. He knew these forests. He knew when something felt wrong. And 4 people vanishing in 6 months, each exactly 4 days past their expected return, all from different trailheads but all in the northern sector. That wasn't coincidence. The coordination point was already busy when he arrived. 3 search and rescue volunteers checking equipment beside Morrison's SUV. James recognized Tom Begay, a Mohawk tracker who'd helped on previous searches, his weathered face unreadable as he studied a topographical map spread across the hood. Coleman. Morrison approached, clipboard in hand, his ranger uniform crisp despite the early hour. Mia Brennan, solo hiker, last seen at the Whispering Pines trailhead 4 days ago. She logged an itinerary, planned to summit Gray Wolf Peak and camp at Mirror Lake before returning. Friend reported her missing when she didn't show up for dinner reservations in Lake Placid. James studied the map Morrison held out. The route Mia had planned cut through some of the most remote sections of the park, miles from the nearest road. Gray Wolf Peak sat at the center of what locals called the Old Territory, a designation that predated the park by centuries, referring to lands the Mohawk and Algonquin peoples had considered sacred and dangerous. The other disappearances, James said quietly. Tyler Marsh's route took him through this area. So did David Whitmore's. Morrison's jaw tightened. James. And Jennifer Costa was photographing wildlife in the northwest quadrant, which shares a watershed with... Enough. Morrison's voice carried the weight of authority and exhaustion. We're here to find Mia Brennan, not chase conspiracy theories. Tom's volunteered to guide you into the backcountry. You two will take the high route toward Gray Wolf, while the other teams sweep the valleys. Tom folded the map with deliberate movements, his dark eyes meeting James's. We should move soon. Weather's changing. James glanced up. The morning sky was still clear, but Tom was right. He could feel it in the pressure, smell it in the air. A storm was coming. They set out within the hour, hiking in silence through old-growth forest where massive hemlocks blocked most of the sun. James had worked with Tom on 2 previous searches, and he'd learned the tracker preferred silence to small talk. That suited James fine. The woods had their own language if you knew how to listen. 3 miles in, Tom stopped beside an ancient oak, its trunk scarred with markings James had seen before but never really examined. They looked like claw marks at first glance, but the pattern was too deliberate, too intentional. They formed symbols. "What are those?" James asked. Tom ran his fingers over the grooves, his expression troubled. "Warnings. Old ones. My grandfather would have known the specific meaning, but..." He trailed off, then pointed to a series of marks that resembled a figure with antlers. "That's the hungry one, the one who walks when the boundaries grow thin." A chill ran down James's spine that had nothing to do with the October air. Boundaries? Between the world of the living and the world of spirits. Tom moved to another tree, finding similar markings. These symbols are Algonquin, very old. They're not directions or territorial markers. They're prohibitions, warnings to stay away. James looked around, seeing the markings everywhere now that he knew what to look for. Dozens of trees, all bearing the same symbols, creating a perimeter. Why would they mark this area specifically? Because something happened here. Something bad enough that they wanted to make sure no one forgot. Tom straightened, his eyes scanning the forest with new wariness. The old stories talk about times when the barrier between worlds weakens, during certain moons at sacred sites when taboos are broken. They say the hungry one crosses over then, wearing the skin of its victims, forever starving, forever hunting. The Wendigo. James had heard the legends, dismissed them as folklore designed to prevent cannibalism during harsh winters. But standing here, surrounded by centuries-old warnings, the stories felt different, heavier. My grandfather called it by an older name, but yes, the Algonquin Wendigo stories aren't just about cannibalism, Coleman. They're about spiritual corruption, about what happens when you consume what should remain sacred. And this place, Tom gestured to the marked trees, was already corrupted when my ancestors found it. Whatever's here is older than their warnings. They pushed deeper into the forest, and James began noticing other things. Deer carcasses, more than there should be, arranged in patterns that didn't match predator behavior. The bones were too clean, picked completely bare, and many showed signs of having been deliberately broken open for marrow. Flocks of crows watched from the trees, silent and motionless. Wrong, because crows were never truly silent. By midday, they reached the lower approaches to Grey Wolf Peak. The hiking trail showed signs of recent use. Boot prints preserved in dried mud, a granola bar wrapper caught in the brush. Tom knelt beside the tracks, his expression darkening. 2 sets of prints, one going up. These would be Mia's, based on the boot size and tread pattern, and one coming down. He pointed to a second set, larger, the stride uneven. But look at the spacing. Sometimes the gait is normal, sometimes the steps are too far apart. Like something learning to walk on 2 legs. James felt his mouth go dry. Could be another hiker. Could be. Tom didn't sound convinced. He moved forward, following the trail, then stopped abruptly. "Coleman, look at this." A backpack lay partially hidden in the undergrowth, its bright blue fabric visible through the ferns. James recognized it immediately. The search brief had included a photo of Mia's gear. His heart sank as he approached, pulling on gloves before touching it. The backpack had been opened, its contents strewn around the area. Clothing, first aid kit, water bottles, all present. But the food was gone, packaging torn open and scattered. And there was something else, something that made James's blood run cold. Scratched into the fabric of the backpack, deep gouges that had torn through the nylon were symbols. The same symbols they'd seen on the trees. The warning signs. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in James's place? "She didn't drop this," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was left here, as a message." James pulled out his radio, his hands suddenly unsteady. "Base, this is Coleman. We've found evidence belonging to the missing hiker. Location is approximately 2 miles southeast of Grey Wolf Peak, elevation 4,200 feet. Recommend additional units." The radio exploded with static so loud James nearly dropped it. Through the noise, he heard something else, a voice, distorted and wrong, speaking what might have been words in a language he didn't recognize. Then, cutting through it all, a scream, brief, desperate, and unmistakably human. The radio went dead. Tom had his rifle unslung, his eyes scanning the tree line. That wasn't coming from the radio. What? The scream. It came from up there. Tom pointed toward the peak, where the forest gave way to rocky terrain. But it shouldn't be possible to hear someone from that distance, not naturally. They moved up the mountain, and the wrongness of the place intensified with every step. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, not even insects. The silence pressed in like a physical weight. James found himself breathing harder than the exertion warranted, his chest tight with an anxiety that seemed to seep from the ground itself. More signs of passage appeared, broken branches at heights that would require someone 7 or 8 feet tall, deep gouges in tree bark that might have been made by claws, or fingers with too many joints, and everywhere that same symbol, the hungry one. They found the first body as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Tyler Marsh had been missing for 6 weeks. What remained of him was barely recognizable as human. James had seen bear attacks, had seen what months of decomposition could do to a body in the woods. This was different. The bones had been cracked open methodically, every trace of marrow gone. The skull showed signs of having been, James's mind rebelled at the thought, deliberately opened. But what made him turn away, bile rising in his throat, were the marks on the surrounding trees. More symbols, but these were carved into the bark with something sharp. And they weren't warnings. Tom had backed away, his face ashen, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. It's feeding here. This is a feeding site. Tom, we need to call this in, get forensics. We need to leave. Now. Tom's voice was sharp with fear James had never heard from the unflappable tracker. The sun is setting. We're in its territory, and the Wendigo hunts at night. But even as Tom spoke, James heard it. A sound like wind through trees, except there was no wind, a whispering. Thousands of voices overlapping, speaking in languages dead for centuries. And beneath it, a wet, rhythmic sound. Breathing. Something massive was breathing, close enough that James could hear the rattle in its lungs. Tom grabbed his arm. Move, don't run, don't make noise, but we need to go now. They retreated down the mountain, every instinct screaming at James to run, to sprint wildly through the darkening forest. But Tom's grip on his arm was iron strong, keeping him to a measured pace. Behind them, the breathing grew louder. Something was following. The forest changed as darkness fell. The trees seemed to lean inward, branches reaching like grasping fingers. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. And the whispering, God, the whispering never stopped. James began to pick out words, phrases in English mixed with older languages. So hungry. Wear your skin. Walk in your shape. They were halfway down the mountain when James made the mistake of looking back. The thing that stood on the trail behind them was tall, impossibly tall, its emaciated frame seeming to fold in on itself in ways that violated anatomy. In the gathering darkness, James couldn't make out details, but he saw enough. Antlers, or something like antlers, crowned its head. Its arms hung too long, ending in hands with too many fingers. And its eyes glowed with a sick yellow light that held nothing but hunger. It tilted its head, studying them, and when it opened its mouth, the voice that emerged was Mia's. James, Tom, help me. I'm so cold. Tom's hand tightened on James's arm, holding him back from the instinctive urge to respond. Not her, the tracker whispered. It's wearing her voice. The thing wearing Mia's voice took a step forward, its gait uneven, like a puppet with tangled strings. Please, it hurts, everything hurts, I just want to go home. James felt tears on his face, horror and grief warring in his chest. If that thing had Mia, if it could use her voice, then she was... Keep moving, Tom urged, pulling him backward. Don't engage, don't answer, don't give it anything to grab onto. They stumbled down the darkening trail, the thing following at a distance, sometimes speaking in Mia's voice, sometimes in voices James didn't recognize. Once it used Rachel's voice, his dead wife, calling his name with the same intimacy she'd used in life. James nearly broke then, nearly turned and rushed toward that familiar sound. But Tom held firm, whispering words in Mohawk that James didn't understand, but felt the weight of prayers, protection, warding. And slowly, as they descended below a certain elevation, the presence faded. The whispering stopped. The yellow eyes vanished into the darkness. They reached Tom's truck just after full dark, both men shaking, covered in sweat despite the cold. Tom drove without speaking, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel, until they were miles from the park boundary. Then he pulled over and vomited on the roadside. James sat in the passenger seat, his mind struggling to process what he'd seen. Every rational part of him wanted to deny it, to find another explanation, but he'd seen it, heard it, felt the malevolent intelligence behind those yellow eyes. The others, James said finally. Tyler, David, Jennifer, and now Mia. Tom wiped his mouth, his eyes haunted. It takes them during the new moon, 4 days after they enter its territory, when the boundary is thinnest. It feeds on them slowly, keeping them alive as long as possible. And then, he trailed off, unable or unwilling to continue. And then it wears them, James finished, understanding now. Uses their voices, their memories to lure more victims. Tom nodded. My grandfather told me stories about a hunting party that went into those hills in 1952. 7 men entered. Only 1 came back, and he was never right after. Kept saying they'd disturbed something, broken some old taboo by camping on sacred ground. Started eating less and less, complaining he was never hungry. 3 months later, he walked back into those woods and was never seen again. James thought about the symbols, the warnings that had stood for centuries. We have to warn Morrison, clear the area, close those trails. And tell him what? That there's a Wendigo in the Adirondacks? Tom laughed, a broken sound. He'll think we've lost our minds. He'll send more search teams in, and that thing will feed on them too. Then what do we do? Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring at the darkness beyond the windshield. My grandfather knew people, traditional people who still remember the old ways to deal with things like this. But those methods aren't pleasant, and they're not always successful. James thought about Mia, about her voice coming from that impossible creature. He thought about Rachel, about the guilt that had driven him here, the need to save someone, anyone, to make up for the one he'd failed to save. And he thought about the other hikers who would inevitably come, drawn by the beautiful wilderness, unaware of what waited in those ancient hills. What do we need to do? Tom turned to look at him, and in the dashboard lights, James saw the weight of terrible knowledge in the tracker's eyes. First, we need to understand what made it. Wendigos aren't born, they're made. Something happened in those hills, something that created a breach between worlds. We need to find out what and when and why the warnings failed. Over the next 3 days, James and Tom researched. Tom contacted tribal elders, piecing together fragments of oral history. James dug through park records, historical documents, old newspaper archives. The picture that emerged was disturbing. The area now encompassing Grey Wolf Peak had been the site of a logging camp in 1889. That winter was particularly brutal, with early snows trapping the workers in the mountains. By the time spring came, only 3 men walked out. They claimed the others had died of exposure and starvation. But local Mohawk people who found the campsite later told a different story. The camp had been built directly on top of an ancient burial ground, and the loggers had used the marked stones for their fire pit. The bodies they found showed signs of cannibalism. The 3 survivors were tracked down and questioned, but they were already changing. Within a year, all 3 had disappeared back into the woods, and the disappearances began. Every few years, hikers would vanish in that area, always in groups of 4, always during the new moon. It's cyclical, Tom explained, spreading maps and documents across James's kitchen table. The Wendigo needs to feed, but it also needs to reproduce its curse. Every generation, it takes 4 victims over 4 lunar cycles. The last victim becomes the new vessel. The spirit leaves the old body and possesses the new one, starting the cycle again. James felt sick. Mia was the 4th victim this cycle, which means the thing wearing the old Wendigo's body is dying. And Mia... Tom couldn't finish the sentence. Can we stop it? Kill it? Killing a Wendigo isn't like killing an animal. The spirit is the threat, and it can jump between hosts if its current body is destroyed without the proper rituals. Tom pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. My grandfather's notes. He learned from a medicine man who dealt with a Wendigo in Manitoba in the 1940s. The process requires going into its territory, finding its feeding ground, and performing a banishment ritual during the hour before dawn on the new moon. Tomorrow night. James absorbed this. And if we fail, then we become food, or worse, vessels for the spirit to inhabit. Tom met his eyes. I won't lie to you, Coleman. The success rate for these interventions is low. Most people who try end up dead or possessed. But if we don't try, Mia's spirit will be trapped in that thing for the next cycle, used to lure more victims. And eventually, someone you care about might hike into those woods. James thought about Rachel again. He'd failed her, arriving too late at the avalanche site, pulling her body from the snow, knowing he'd never get those minutes back. He couldn't fail again. He wouldn't. What do we need? Tom pulled out a list. Sacred tobacco, cedar, sweetgrass, a knife that's never drawn blood, and something personal from someone who died without corruption, someone who can act as an anchor point for the ritual. James knew what he had to offer before Tom finished speaking. Rachel's wedding ring, which he'd worn on a chain around his neck for 3 years, the symbol of love unbroken by death. It was the most personal, most sacred thing he owned. They prepared through the day, and as the sun set on the new moon, they drove back to the park. This time they were ready, or as ready as anyone could be to face a creature that existed in the spaces between mythology and nightmare. The hike up the mountain in darkness was surreal. Tom carried a traditional torch soaked in cedar oil, its smoke creating a protective barrier that the Wendigo seemed reluctant to cross. James carried supplies and his service weapon, though he wasn't sure how much good bullets would do. They found the feeding ground again, Tyler's remains, along with 3 other bodies in various states of consumption. Tom began the ritual, creating a circle of sacred tobacco, lighting bundles of sweetgrass and cedar, speaking words in Algonquin that James didn't understand but felt in his bones. And then the Wendigo came. It was larger than before, or perhaps James could simply see it better by torchlight. 12 feet tall, its gray skin stretched tight over protruding bones, every rib visible, its stomach distended from its last meal. The antlers weren't antlers at all. They were branches that had grown through its skull, bursting from the bone, still bearing dead leaves. Its face was almost human. Might have been human once, but the features had elongated, the jaw extending to accommodate rows of teeth filed to points. It spoke in Mia's voice, but the words were all wrong, disjointed. James, help. So hungry. Make it stop. Feed. Need to feed. Tom continued the ritual, his voice rising, calling on spirits of protection, on ancestors, on the sacred guardians of the boundary between worlds. He took the knife, blessed, purified, never used for violence, and cut his palm, letting blood fall onto the circle. The Wendigo screamed, a sound that had nothing human in it, and lunged forward. The sacred circle held barely, smoke and blood forming a barrier that seared the creature's reaching hands. It recoiled, then began circling, looking for weaknesses, speaking in dozens of voices now, all its victims over more than a century, calling out for help, for mercy, for death. Tom thrust the knife toward James. Your turn. The anchor, add it to the circle. The love that survived death can bind the spirit, trap it long enough for the banishment. James pulled Rachel's ring from around his neck, his hands shaking. For 3 years, this ring had been his connection to her, his reminder that love hadn't died with her body. Giving it up felt like losing her all over again. But Mia was still in there somewhere, trapped in that monstrosity. And other hikers would come, other victims. He dropped the ring into the circle, and the reaction was immediate. The smoke flared bright white, forming shapes, figures of light that rose from the circle like spirits summoned from beyond. Rachel was among them. James saw her clearly, saw her smile at him, saw her mouth words. Let go. The spirits surrounded the Wendigo, their light burning into its flesh. It thrashed and screamed, its voice fracturing into hundreds of separate cries. And then, through the cacophony, James heard Mia's voice. Her real voice, weak but present. Thank you. The Wendigo's body began to crack, light streaming from fissures in its skin. Tom's voice rose to a shout, the final words of banishment, and the circle of light contracted, drawing the creature down, pulling it into the earth from which it had been called. The light faded, the Wendigo was gone, and in its place, partially visible in the disturbed soil, James saw bones, very old bones, and the remains of a logging campfire pit, stones carved with symbols that were never meant to be moved. They buried the bones properly. Tom performed last rites over the remains of all the victims they could find. As dawn broke over Grey Wolf Peak, James felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. Not happiness, but an acceptance that he'd done what he could, saved who he could save. She's free now, Tom said quietly, and James knew he meant both Mia and Rachel. They all are. They hiked back down as the sun rose, 2 men who'd seen too much, carrying knowledge that would never fully leave them. Morrison would ask questions about the missing hiker, about Tyler's remains. James would tell him what he could, leave out what he must. But the nightmares would continue. Some of them were already starting. Dreams of yellow eyes, of whispered voices, of hunger that could never be satisfied. Because even though they'd banished the Wendigo, even though they'd freed its victims, James had looked into its eyes. He'd heard its voice, and part of him would always be in those dark woods listening to the whispers, wondering if the hunger would ever truly die. 3 weeks later, Tom called him with news. The tribal elders had performed additional rituals, reconsecrating the ground, replacing the warnings that had been disturbed. The area around Grey Wolf Peak had been officially closed, declared a protected indigenous heritage site. No more hikers would be allowed in. But James knew the truth. The boundary between worlds was thinner there now, worn by more than a century of violence and violation. They'd stopped one Wendigo, but the conditions that created it still existed. The warning stood for a reason, and humanity's gift for ignoring warnings was exceeded only by its capacity for curiosity. He kept Rachel's ring on his desk now, no longer around his neck. Tom had retrieved it from the circle, and though it bore scorch marks from the ritual, it was whole. Sometimes in quiet moments, James would touch it and remember both what he'd lost and what he'd saved. The wilderness kept its secrets, and some secrets, James had learned, were warnings in themselves. The marked trees stood sentinel in the old territory, their symbols clear to those who knew how to read them. Some hungers can never be satisfied, some boundaries should never be crossed, and some places belong to forces older and darker than human understanding. The Wendigo was gone, but the hunger remained, waiting in the spaces between trees, in the silence of the deep woods, in the places where humans forgot to respect what they didn't understand. James would remember. He would carry that weight, that knowledge, ensuring that no one else had to face what he'd faced. It was a small redemption, but it was enough. For now. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Ethan Cross had always believed that every mystery had a rational explanation. After 12 years as a forensic analyst for the National Park Service, he'd investigated dozens of disappearances, and each one eventually revealed itself through evidence, logic, and methodical inquiry. Missing hikers were found hypothermic in ravines, disoriented by dehydration, or victims of wildlife encounters that left predictable patterns. The wilderness was dangerous, certainly, but it followed rules. Laws of nature that could be understood, predicted, managed. That confidence felt almost quaint now as he stood at the trailhead of the Cascade Ridge Trail in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, staring at the dense wall of Douglas firs that seemed to swallow the narrow path. It was late October 2018, and the forest wore its autumn colors like a warning, deep crimsons and burnt oranges that looked too much like old blood against the dark bark. The parking area held only his government SUV and Amelia Hartwell's abandoned Subaru, its windows already filmed with morning condensation. Amelia had been missing for 4 days. She was a 28-year-old anthropology PhD candidate from the University of Washington, researching indigenous spiritual practices of the Pacific Northwest tribes. Her advisor had reported her missing when she failed to attend a scheduled video conference and didn't respond to repeated calls. Park rangers had found her car, but no sign of her on the marked trails. That's when they'd called Ethan. He pulled Amelia's research folder from his backpack, studying her photograph again. Dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a slight smile that suggested someone who took her work seriously, but not herself. According to her notes, she'd been documenting sacred sites and interviewing tribal elders about traditional shamanic practices. Her last journal entry, dated the day she vanished, mentioned finding something extraordinary off the main trail, approximately 3 miles northeast of the parking area. Ethan shouldered his pack, checked his radio, reception was weak but functional, and started up the trail. The morning air was crisp and carried the smell of decaying leaves and damp earth. Completely normal. His boots crunched on the frost-hardened ground as he walked, his breath misting in front of him. The forest was quiet in the way October forests should be, most birds having migrated south, the summer insects long dead. He'd walked these woods many times during training exercises and previous investigations. He knew the terrain, understood its hazards, respected its power to disorient and endanger the unprepared. But Amelia hadn't been unprepared. Her gear list showed she was properly equipped, experienced in backcountry travel, and cautious. People like her didn't just vanish. After 40 minutes of steady climbing, Ethan reached the point where, according to her GPS coordinates, Amelia had left the established trail. He found the spot easily. A cluster of broken branches marked her passage into the deeper forest. He paused, studying the ground. Her boot prints were still visible in the soft earth, heading northeast into an area the topographic maps showed as a shallow valley surrounded by steep ridges. Old-growth forest, dense and largely unexplored. He marked the location on his GPS and followed her trail. The forest changed as he left the maintained path. The trees grew closer together, their canopy blocking most of the morning light and creating a permanent twilight. The undergrowth thickened, salal bushes, Oregon grape, and sword ferns forming barriers that forced him to follow Amelia's exact route. She'd been pushing through here with purpose, not the meandering path of someone exploring casually. 20 minutes into the bushwhack, Ethan noticed the first anomaly. Hanging from a low branch was what appeared to be a small bundle of sticks, bound with some kind of dried plant fiber. He stopped, studying it without touching. The sticks were arranged in a specific pattern, forming a rough humanoid shape. He'd seen similar objects in textbooks on indigenous spiritual practices, warning markers, boundary indicators for sacred spaces. The tribes of this region had used such markers for centuries to denote areas that were forbidden, dangerous, or reserved for ceremonial use. He photographed it carefully, noting its exact location. Amelia would have recognized this for what it was. Had she ignored the warning, or had her academic curiosity overridden caution? The trail continued, and Ethan followed. His analytical mind cataloged details automatically. The species of trees, the slope of the terrain, the way the light filtered through the canopy. Everything normal, everything explainable. Then he found the second marker, and the third, and the fourth. They formed a perimeter, he realized, roughly circular, perhaps a quarter-mile in diameter. Each marker was slightly different but carried the same essential message. Turn back. Whatever lay at the center of this circle was meant to be avoided. Ethan's radio crackled with static. He pulled it from his belt, but the noise resolved into nothing coherent. Interference from the terrain, probably. The steep ridges could create dead zones. He'd mentioned it in his report. He pressed on, and the forest grew darker still. The temperature seemed to drop, though his thermometer showed no significant change. A trick of the reduced sunlight, his rational mind supplied. The undergrowth thinned here, the ground covered instead with a thick carpet of moss that muffled his footsteps completely. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against his ears. That's when he smelled it. Death has a distinctive odor, one Ethan had unfortunately become familiar with over his career. But this wasn't quite that. It was something older, more complex. Decay mixed with something acrid and medicinal, like burning sage and rotting meat combined. The smell grew stronger as he advanced, making him breathe through his mouth. The trees opened into a small clearing, perhaps 30 feet across. And there, Ethan stopped completely, his training and experience suddenly insufficient to process what he was seeing. The clearing's center held what could only be described as a shrine, but one that set off every alarm bell in his forensic mind. A circle of stones formed the boundary, each stone painted or marked with symbols that Ethan didn't recognize but which raised the hair on the back of his neck. Inside the circle were items that had no business being there. Animal bones arranged in patterns, strips of what looked like hide or leather hanging from wooden stakes, feathers, dozens of feathers, and at the very center, a fire pit that showed recent use, the stones still blackened with soot. But it was what hung from the surrounding trees that made Ethan's blood run cold. Pelts, animal skins, stretched and dried, suspended from branches all around the clearing. He counted 7 of them. Coyote, he thought, though the preservation method made them difficult to identify with certainty. Each pelt faced inward toward the circle, empty eye sockets seeming to watch the center of the shrine. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he raised his camera. This wasn't just a sacred site, this was active. Someone had been here recently within days, and everything about it felt wrong in a way that his rational mind struggled to articulate. He began documenting systematically, photographing from multiple angles, taking notes on his waterproof pad. The symbols on the stones resembled some Native American petroglyphs he'd seen in anthropology journals, but they were mixed with others he didn't recognize. Some looked almost European, like runes. The bone arrangements suggested ritualistic purpose, but the specific patterns were unknown to him. Then he saw Amelia's backpack. It lay half hidden in the underbrush on the far side of the clearing, its bright blue fabric incongruous against the dark forest floor. Ethan's heart rate spiked. He approached carefully, scanning the ground for any other evidence. The pack had been opened, its contents partially spilled. A water bottle, energy bars, a rolled sleeping bag. But her research notebook was missing, along with her camera and GPS unit. He keyed his radio again. "Base, this is Cross. I've located evidence of the missing subject, requesting immediate backup and SAR team to my coordinates." Only static answered him. He tried again, adjusting frequencies. Nothing. The radio was functioning. He could hear the carrier wave, but no signal was getting through. A sound behind him made Ethan spin around. Nothing, just the trees, the hanging pelts swaying slightly in a breeze he couldn't feel. He returned his attention to the backpack, pulling on latex gloves before examining it more thoroughly. No blood, no signs of struggle. It appeared to have been set down deliberately, not dropped in panic. So where was Amelia? A branch snapped somewhere in the forest, loud in the oppressive silence. Ethan straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the canister of bear spray on his belt. "Hello, Amelia. This is Park Service." The forest swallowed his words without echo. The silence that followed felt expectant, as if something was listening. Another sound, closer now. Not footsteps. Something else. A low, rhythmic noise that might have been breathing, or might have been wind through hollow wood, or might have been something his rational mind refused to categorize. "Hello?" He tried to keep his voice steady, professional. "I'm with the National Park Service. If you can hear me, please respond." Movement caught his eye. One of the pelts was turning, rotating slowly on its cord despite the absence of wind. As it turned, Ethan saw that the inside of the hide had been painted with more symbols, red and black pigments forming patterns that seemed to writhe in his peripheral vision. He backed away from the clearing, maintaining visual contact with his surroundings, his forensic training warring with an instinct he'd never experienced before, a primal urge to run, not walk, run. The temperature had definitely dropped now. He could see his breath thick clouds of vapor. His thermometer read 42 degrees. 5 minutes ago it had been 56. Something was very wrong here, and Ethan's rational mind was beginning to crack around the edges, letting in possibilities he'd never entertained. He needed to get back to the trail, contact base, bring in a proper team. Whatever had happened to Amelia, whatever this place was, it was beyond his ability to handle alone. He turned to leave the clearing and froze. In the moss where he'd entered, where his boot prints should have been clearly visible, there was nothing. The moss was undisturbed, as if he'd never walked there at all, which was impossible. He'd just come that way 60 seconds ago. Ethan's breathing quickened. He pulled out his GPS unit. The screen showed his location clearly, but the trail he'd followed, the entire route he'd taken, wasn't displayed. According to the device, he was standing in the middle of uninterrupted forest with no path leading in or out. That's when he heard the voice. Ethan. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that might have been wind through leaves but formed his name too perfectly to be coincidence. Ethan, come deeper. He spun, scanning the trees. Nothing. No one. Just the clearing with its sinister shrine and the hanging pelts that now seemed to be facing him, tracking his movement. His radio crackled suddenly to life, but instead of his dispatch, it emitted a sound like whispering in a language he didn't understand. Multiple voices overlapping, rising and falling in rhythms that suggested words but conveyed only wrongness. Ethan switched it off with shaking hands. Something moved in the forest beyond the clearing, a figure glimpsed between trees. Human-shaped but wrong somehow, its movements too fluid, too quick. Amelia? His voice cracked. The figure stopped, perhaps 50 feet away, partially obscured by underbrush. In the dim light, Ethan couldn't make out details, but something about its posture made his skin crawl. It was watching him, studying him. Then it smiled. He could see that clearly even at this distance. A too-wide smile that showed too many teeth. Every instinct Ethan possessed screamed at him to run. But where? His trail was gone. His GPS was lying to him. His radio was useless. And something in those trees was wearing a smile no human face could manage. The figure took a step toward him, and Ethan noticed it wasn't walking on the ground. It was touching the earth, yes, but not quite connecting, as if it weighed nothing. Like it was something wearing the idea of walking rather than actually doing it. Ethan did something he'd never done in 12 years of field work. He ran. He crashed through the underbrush, abandoning protocol and caution. His analytical mind finally overridden by pure animal terror. Behind him, he heard movement, fast, impossibly fast, keeping pace effortlessly. Not on the ground, but through the trees themselves, something moving from branch to branch with a sound like leather sliding over wood. His boot caught a root, and he went down hard, the impact driving air from his lungs. He rolled onto his back, scrabbling for the bear spray, and saw it. The thing was above him, clinging to a tree trunk 10 feet up, its body oriented toward him in defiance of gravity. In the better light, Ethan could see what his mind had been refusing to process. It wore human shape like an ill-fitting suit, limbs too long, joints bending in ways that suggested additional articulation, skin that seemed loose and shifted as if independent of the body beneath. But it was the face that destroyed the last of his rational defenses. It was wearing Amelia's face. Not like a mask, not like makeup. Her actual face, stretched over something fundamentally not her, not human. Her eyes, her nose, her mouth, all present but arranged on a skull structure that was subtly wrong. And through those borrowed features, something else looked out. Something ancient and hungry and utterly alien to human experience. The thing that wore Amelia's face tilted its head, studying him with predatory intelligence. When it spoke, it used her voice, but layered underneath were other voices, older voices, speaking in languages that predated English by millennia. You shouldn't have come here, Ethan. This place is ours, has always been ours. Your people were warned, but your people never listen. Ethan's hand found the bear spray, but he knew with sick certainty that it would be useless. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't anything that pepper spray could stop. What are you? The question escaped him involuntarily, the scientist in him still desperate for explanation, even as terror overwhelmed his rational mind. The creature's smile widened further, Amelia's lips stretching impossibly. We are ye Nald Lushi. We are those who walk on 4 legs wearing 2. We are what waits in the spaces between, what hungers at the boundaries. Your friend wanted to know our secrets, so we taught her. We showed her what lies beneath the skin of the world, and now, it leaned closer, and Ethan could smell that awful smell again. Death and medicine and wrongness. Now we will teach you. The creature dropped from the tree, landing silently on all 4s despite its human shape. Its movements were fluid, boneless, as it began to circle him. Ethan scrambled backward, his back hitting a tree trunk, trapped. The elders warned her, the creature continued, its voice shifting between Amelia's and something else, something that sounded like wind through bones. They told her the stories. They told her which places to avoid, which taboos must be honored. But she didn't believe. She thought they were myths, superstitions. So she came here, to this place where the membrane is thin, where we can reach through. She came with her cameras and her questions and her disrespect. The creature's form rippled, and for a moment Ethan saw what was really there, something that made his mind recoil, unable to process the geometry of its true shape. Then Amelia's face reasserted itself, like a television signal stabilizing. We showed her the truth. And truth is a terrible thing when you've spent your life believing comfortable lies. Where is she? Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. Where is Amelia? The creature laughed, a sound like wind through a hollow tree. She is here. She is there. She is becoming. She wore flesh so loosely, held herself so uncertainly. It was easy to slip inside, easy to wear her. And soon, when the transformation is complete, she will hunt with us. She will walk in both worlds, neither and both. It moved closer, and Ethan pressed himself against the tree, every muscle locked. The creature reached out with hands that were Amelia's but weren't. Fingers too long, too many joints, nails yellowed and sharp. You thought you could understand us with your science, your logic, your little devices. But we are older than your explanations. We are the truth your people forgot when they stopped listening to the darkness. The fingers touched Ethan's face, and where they made contact, his skin burned with cold. He tried to scream but found his voice frozen, trapped in his chest by terror so profound it transcended mere fear. But we are not cruel, the creature whispered. We give you a choice. Run. Try to find your way back. We will hunt you through these woods, and if you survive until dawn, you may keep your skin. You may return to your world of explanations and reports and comfortable lies. But if we catch you, the smile widened impossibly. If we catch you, we add your face to our collection. We learn to wear your shape, and through you, we will walk in the world beyond these trees, finally free of the boundaries your ancestors made. The creature released him and stepped back. Run, Ethan Cross. Run, and perhaps you will finally understand what your ancestors knew, that there are places where human certainty ends and older truths begin. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He ran. He crashed through the forest blindly, his analytical mind completely shattered, operating on pure survival instinct. Behind him he heard laughter, multiple voices, some human, some not, echoing through the trees. And underneath the laughter, the sound of pursuit, not heavy footfalls but something lighter, faster, something moving through the forest with predatory ease. The woods seemed to shift around him, paths closing, clearings appearing where none should exist. His compass spun wildly, unable to find north. His GPS showed him moving in circles despite running in a straight line. Every tool, every device, Every piece of rational technology that should have helped him was useless here, in this place where different rules applied. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs trembled with exhaustion, until his rational mind, that precious analytical tool he'd relied on his entire life, finally broke completely and let in the truth he'd been denying. There were things in these woods older than human understanding, things that had been here long before the first tribes came, things that had made compacts and agreements and established boundaries. And those boundaries had been violated. The taboos had been broken, and now something ancient and hungry was loose, wearing stolen faces and hunting in the spaces between worlds. Ethan stumbled and fell again, rolling down a short slope to land in a narrow ravine. Above him, the sky was darkening. Either dusk was falling impossibly fast, or the forest itself was thickening, blocking out the light. He lay there, gasping, his body spent, his mind hovering on the edge of complete psychological collapse. That's when he saw them. Figures in the trees above, dozens of them, clinging to trunks and branches, their bodies oriented at impossible angles, each wearing a different face, some old, some young, some fresh enough that Ethan recognized them from missing persons reports that had crossed his desk over the years, all watching him with eyes that held no humanity, only hunger. And in the center, hanging from a branch directly above him, was Amelia. The real Amelia, or what was left of her. Her skin had been removed carefully, expertly, stretched and preserved like the coyote pelts in the clearing. But her eyes still moved, tracking him, and through some horror beyond comprehension, her lips moved, forming words without sound. Run! The creatures above began to descend. Ethan forced his shattered body to move, crawling, then staggering to his feet, moving forward because stopping meant death or worse. The ravine narrowed, became a crack in the earth, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He squeezed through, desperate as hands reached for him from above. Cold hands with too many joints, wearing skin that wasn't their own. The crack opened suddenly into a wider space and Ethan fell through, landing hard on stone. He looked up and saw stars, real stars, the actual night sky. He was on the trail, the actual maintained trail, the one he'd left hours ago. His SUV was visible 50 yards away, parked under a trailhead light that had just flickered on in the gathering dusk. Ethan didn't question it. He ran for the vehicle, fumbling for keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key in the lock. The door opened and he threw himself inside, slamming it shut, hitting the locks, starting the engine with a roar that sounded like salvation. He didn't look back as he tore out of the parking lot, tires screaming on the pavement, didn't look at the rearview mirror, kept his eyes forward, focused on the white lines of the highway, on the lights of civilization that grew brighter as he fled the forest. It was only when he reached the ranger station, stumbling through the door into the bright fluorescent light, that he allowed himself to stop, to breathe, to try to speak. The rangers on duty jumped up, alarmed by his appearance. He knew he must look wild, clothes torn, face scratched, eyes probably showing too much white. Cross? What happened? Did you find... Don't go back there, Ethan interrupted, his voice cracking. Don't send anyone back there. The clearing, the Northeast Valley, it's... He trailed off, realizing how he would sound, how insane the truth was. Did you find Hartwell? The chief ranger pressed. Ethan opened his mouth to explain, to tell them everything, and found he couldn't. Because how could he explain what he'd seen? How could he put into words what he'd encountered? They would think him mad. Or worse, they might believe him and go anyway, with their radios and their GPS and their rational minds, and they would all die, or worse than die. I found her backpack, he finally said. I found evidence of activity, ritualistic activity. But I lost radio contact and... He stopped, watching their faces. They were already skeptical. Over the following days, a proper search and rescue operation was mounted. They found Amelia's backpack where Ethan had left it. They found the clearing with its shrine. They even found boot prints, Ethan's own, leading in but not leading out. But they found no bodies. No Amelia. No evidence of the creatures Ethan had seen. The pelts that had hung from the trees were gone. The symbols on the stones looked, in daylight photographs, like natural mineral discoloration. Nothing conclusive, nothing that couldn't be explained. Ethan was placed on administrative leave. Psychological evaluation, trauma from the stress of the investigation, they said. Hallucinations brought on by disorientation and fear. A rational explanation for irrational experiences. He didn't argue. What could he say? That his rational mind had been shattered by the truth? That there were things in those woods older than human understanding? That Amelia was gone, not dead but transformed, becoming something else? He accepted the leave, accepted the therapy, accepted the comfortable lies of the rational world. But at night when he closed his eyes, he saw them, the creatures in the trees, watching with borrowed faces. And sometimes, in the moment between waking and sleeping, he heard Amelia's voice, or what used to be her voice, whispering from the darkness. "We'll be waiting, Ethan. When you're ready. When you finally understand that your world of explanations is just a thin shell over something much older, much stranger. We'll be waiting." And on his office wall, though he never remembered placing it there, hung a single feather, black as midnight, marked with symbols he didn't recognize but which filled him with cold dread whenever he looked at them too long. The rational world continued around him. Reports were filed, cases were closed, explanations were accepted. But Ethan Cross knew the truth now, knew it in a way that could never be unlearned. There were places where the membrane between worlds grew thin, where old things waited in the dark, wearing faces they'd stolen and hungering for more. And somewhere in those woods, in a place beyond GPS coordinates and trail maps, Amelia Hartwell walked on four legs, wore skin that wasn't her own, and hunted in the spaces between. The case file listed her as missing, presumed dead. But Ethan knew better. She wasn't dead. She was becoming. And one day, when the transformation was complete, she would walk out of those woods wearing her own face again, and no one would know what she'd become underneath. No one, except Ethan. And that knowledge would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might be. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? James Martinez had spent 15 years as a search and rescue coordinator for the National Park Service, and in that time, he'd developed an almost religious devotion to logic. Every missing person case followed patterns. People got lost because they wandered off trail, underestimated distances, or overestimated their abilities. The wilderness wasn't malevolent. It was indifferent. That indifference killed people through exposure, dehydration, falls. Simple cause and effect. No mysteries, just physics and poor judgment. Which was why, on that October morning in 2019, he approached the Evelyn Hartley case with his usual methodical calm. 26-year-old botanist, experienced hiker, disappeared 3 days ago in the Kaibab National Forest's most remote section. Her last known position was near the old Navajo boundary markers, which locals avoided, but tourists loved to photograph. James had already plotted probability zones, coordinated air searches, and established a command post. Everything by the book. The forest ranger, Tommy B. Gay, stood beside James's truck, his weathered face unreadable. Tommy was Navajo, third-generation ranger, and one of the few people James genuinely respected. The man knew these woods better than anyone. Air search found her camp 2 hours ago, Tommy said, handing James a tablet with aerial photos. Tents still standing, sleeping bag laid out, food untouched. James zoomed in on the images. So she left in a hurry or something interrupted her. James. Tommy's voice carried a weight James had never heard before. You need to see something before you go up there. Something the drone captured that I sent to your encrypted file. James pulled up the file on his own tablet. The video showed Evelyn's campsite from above, standard documentation footage. Then the drone's camera panned west, following what appeared to be a trail of disturbed vegetation. The trail led to a small clearing about 200 yards from the camp. What James saw in that clearing made his finger pause over the screen. At first, his brain tried to categorize it as shadows, as a trick of the afternoon light through the trees. But he'd analyzed thousands of hours of aerial footage. He knew how light behaved, how shadows fell. This wasn't shadows. In the center of the clearing stood what looked like a man, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, perhaps 7 feet, but the limbs were too long, the joints bending at angles that human anatomy didn't allow. The figure was dark, not like skin, but like it absorbed light. A void in the shape of something that had once been human. And around it, in a perfect circle, every piece of vegetation, grass, shrubs, even the bark on nearby trees, had turned black, as if burned. But there was no char, no ash, just black. The figure's head turned toward the drone, not slowly, but in a single jerking motion like a bird. And though the resolution wasn't perfect, James could swear he saw its eyes, or where eyes should be, glowing with a dull red luminescence. Drone lost signal immediately after this, Tommy said quietly. Crashed. We found it. Every electronic component was dead. Not damaged. Dead. Like the circuits had been drained. James's hands were steady, but his mind was racing through explanations. Hoax. Digital artifact. Lens flare. Someone in a costume. His rational mind threw up every possible barrier against what his eyes were showing him. This has to be manipulated footage, James said, but his voice lacked conviction. I was there when we received it, James. Direct satellite feed. No intermediary, and I've seen that thing before. Tommy's jaw clenched. 30 years ago, when I was 16, my grandfather warned me about the old places, told me some boundaries exist for reasons that have nothing to do with property lines. I didn't listen. Went hiking past the markers with some friends. We saw it, standing between the trees, watching us. We ran. One of my friends, David Yellowhorse, he looked back. Just for a second, he looked directly at it. He was never the same. Started wasting away, stopped eating, had nightmares about being hollowed out. He killed himself 6 months later. James wanted to dismiss this as superstition, folklore, the kind of stories people told to explain tragedy. But the footage remained on his screen, impossible to rationalize away. What is it? James heard himself ask. My grandfather called it Yinaldlushi, the Navajo word for skinwalker, but that's not quite right. It's older than that word, older than any word we have. It's what happens when someone breaks the worst taboos, performs the worst rituals. They gain power, but they stop being human. They become something that exists between the living world and the spirit world, always hungry for what they've lost. Tommy, I need you to understand that I can't put killed by skinwalker in my report. I know, but I needed you to know what you're walking into. Tommy met his eyes. Evelyn saw it, I'm certain, and if she looked at it directly, if she made eye contact, then finding her body is the best outcome we can hope for. James felt cold despite the warm morning sun. I have to find her. That's my job. I know. I'm coming with you. You'll need someone who knows the old ways, the protections. Tommy pulled out a small leather pouch from his jacket. Corn pollen, blessed by a medicine man, and these. He revealed what looked like small carved stones with symbols James didn't recognize. Stay inside these boundaries at night. Don't break the circle. Every instinct, James had screamed that this was absurd, that he was a scientist, a professional, that magic and monsters didn't exist. But that image on the screen existed. The dead drone existed. And somewhere in those woods, Evelyn Hartley existed, in whatever state she was now in. They assembled a small team. James kept it minimal, himself, Tommy, and 2 experienced trackers, both local Navajo who Tommy vouched for. As they prepared to hike in, James noticed both trackers wore traditional turquoise jewelry and carried medicine pouches similar to Tommy's. Nobody spoke about the footage, but everyone moved with a tension James had never felt on search operations before. The hike to Evelyn's camp took 4 hours. The forest seemed normal at first, ponderosa pines, scrub oak, the usual high desert ecosystem. But as they crossed the old boundary markers, weathered stones carved with symbols that looked like they might have been there for centuries, something changed. The forest didn't look different. It felt different. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. The light, though it was only mid-afternoon, seemed dimmer, as if filtered through water. "Everyone feels it, right?" one of the trackers, Joseph, asked. "I'm not crazy?" "You feel it," Tommy confirmed. James wanted to attribute it to suggestion, to psychological priming, but he couldn't deny the sensation. It was like walking into a room where something terrible had happened. The space itself remembered. They found Evelyn's camp exactly as the aerial footage had shown. Tent pristine, equipment organized but abandoned. James conducted his standard evidence collection, documenting everything, but his hands moved mechanically while his mind kept returning to that clearing 200 yards west. "I need to see the clearing," James said. Tommy nodded grimly. "We go together, nobody alone, and we don't look directly at anything we find there. Eyes down or peripheral vision only. That's not superstition, James. It's survival." The walk to the clearing was the longest 200 yards of James's life. The sense of wrongness intensified with every step. The trees here were silent. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling the leaves. Just suffocating silence. They emerged into the clearing, and James understood immediately why the drone footage hadn't adequately prepared him. The circle of blackened vegetation was wider than it had appeared from above, perhaps 30 feet in diameter. But it wasn't the size that stopped James cold. It was the smell. Decay and ozone and something else, something his brain refused to process. And the temperature. Inside the circle, the air was at least 20 degrees colder than the surrounding forest. At the center of the circle, driven into the ground, was a stake. Tied to it was a piece of fabric that James recognized from Evelyn's clothing description. Her red bandana. But the bandana wasn't just tied there. It had been arranged with other objects. Small bones. James hoped they were animal bones. Feathers, and what looked like ash formed into symbols around the stake. "Ritual," Tommy whispered. "It's claiming her, marking her as its own." James forced himself to think logically. Someone could have staged this. Someone who took her could have... His words died as Joseph grabbed his arm and pointed. At the edge of the clearing, between two pines, something stood. James's training kicked in. His eyes started to track toward it to identify the threat. But Tommy grabbed his face, forcibly turning his head away. "Don't look at it directly. I told you." But James had seen enough in that split second. The impossible proportions, the wrong angles. The way it stood perfectly still yet seemed to vibrate with a frequency that made his eyes water. And worst of all, he'd felt it looking back at him. Felt its attention like a physical weight, like cold hands pressing on his skull. "We need to leave. Now," Tommy commanded. The trackers were already moving, backing away without turning their backs on the tree line. They retreated to Evelyn's camp, and James's mind spun. He'd seen it. He'd actually seen it. Not footage, not second-hand accounts, but with his own eyes. And his rational worldview, built over 15 years of logical problem-solving, cracked like ice under pressure. As they hastily set up their own camp, there was no way they could make it back before dark. James tried to process what he'd witnessed. His hands shook as he assembled his tent. Shock, he told himself. Just shock. But he knew it was more than that. It was the foundational terror of realizing that the universe operated on rules he'd never suspected existed. Tommy and the trackers worked quickly, creating a protective circle around their camp using the carved stones and corn pollen. They drew symbols in the dirt that Tommy explained were wards, protections from the old medicine ways. James wanted to mock it, wanted to assert his scientific understanding, but he found himself helping instead, desperate for any barrier between himself and what he'd seen. As the sun set, the forest transformed. The oppressive silence deepened into something alive, something watchful. James sat by the fire they'd built, checking and rechecking his equipment. Radio, GPS, satellite phone, all working, but the signals were weak, distorted. He tried to reach base camp. Martinez to base, do you copy? Static. Then underneath the static, something else. A voice? No, voices. Multiple voices speaking in a language James didn't understand, overlapping, urgent. Don't use the radio, Tommy said. It's a channel. Opens connections. Tonight we stay quiet. One of the trackers, Joseph, was praying softly in Navajo, his hands moving in ritualistic patterns. The other tracker, Raymond, sat rigid, watching the darkness beyond their fire with wide eyes. What's it waiting for? James asked. For one of us to break the circle, Tommy said, or for our protections to weaken. These wards, they work, but they're not absolute. They're barriers made of belief and tradition. Against something that powerful, they're like paper walls. Better than nothing, but only just. Hours passed. James tried to stay alert, but exhaustion pulled at him. He'd been awake for nearly 20 hours. His eyes kept drifting shut, then snapping open at every sound. Except there were no sounds. That was what kept him afraid. The forest should have been alive with nocturnal animals, insects, the rustle of wind. Instead, nothing. Around midnight, Raymond suddenly stood up, his movements jerky, unnatural. "Raymond?" Tommy called out. Raymond didn't respond. His eyes were open but vacant, looking at something none of them could see. He began walking toward the edge of their protective circle. Tommy and Joseph lunged for him, pulling him back just as his foot was about to cross the line of stones and pollen. Raymond collapsed, gasping, his eyes suddenly focusing. "I heard her," Raymond whispered. "I heard Evelyn calling for help. She was crying, saying she was hurt just beyond the trees. I could hear her so clearly." "You heard what it wanted you to hear," Tommy said grimly. "It can imitate voices, memories. It knows what will draw you out." James felt his blood run cold. Can it imitate anything? Before Tommy could answer, James heard his wife's voice, clear as crystal, calling from the darkness beyond their camp. "James? James, honey, where are you? I'm lost. Please help me." Maria, his wife's voice, her exact tone, the slight accent on certain words. James knew that Maria was home in Flagstaff 200 miles away. But the voice sounded so real, so frightened. His legs were moving before he realized it, drawn toward that familiar voice calling for help. Tommy tackled him, both men crashing to the ground. "It's not her. It's not real." The voice continued, growing more desperate, more familiar. "James, please, it's so cold. Why won't you help me?" James clamped his hands over his ears, but the voice seemed to come from inside his skull. Tears streamed down his face, not from sadness, but from the sheer cognitive dissonance of hearing his wife in danger and being unable to respond. His rational mind screamed that it was a trick, an auditory hallucination, but some deeper part of him, the part that evolution had designed to respond to human voices, especially loved ones in distress, was overriding every logical thought. Then, as suddenly as it started, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was worse. "It's playing with us," Joseph said quietly, "testing our defenses, our resolve." James lay on the ground, staring up at the stars visible through the forest canopy. Those stars, at least, were real. Distant suns, their light traveling for years to reach Earth. Physics, math, predictable, quantifiable. He clung to that thought like a drowning man to driftwood. "Tommy," James said, his voice hoarse. "You said Evelyn saw it, that she looked at it. Is there any chance she's still alive?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment. In my grandfather's stories, when someone makes direct eye contact with Yinald Lushi, it creates a connection, a tether. The creature can track them anywhere, can enter their dreams, can feed on their life force slowly. But it doesn't usually kill quickly. It consumes gradually. The person wastes away, loses their mind, sometimes over months. Unless... He trailed off. Unless what? unless the skinwalker wants to create another, to pass on the curse. Then it takes them to sacred places that have been corrupted, places where the boundary between the spirit world and ours is already thin, and it performs rituals. If Evelyn is alive, she might be somewhere like that. But James, what we'd find wouldn't be someone we could save. It would be someone in the process of transformation, of becoming something like it. James sat up, his analytical mind trying to process this. You're saying she could be becoming one of those things? I'm saying we might already be too late. And if we're not, if we interrupt the ritual, we might face two of them instead of one. The rest of the night passed in tortured wakefulness. James dozed briefly, but his dreams were filled with impossible geometry, with spaces that folded in on themselves, with the sensation of being watched by something vast and ancient and utterly alien to human comprehension. He woke gasping, to find the others similarly affected, all staring into the dying fire with haunted eyes. Dawn brought relief and new terror in equal measure. The oppressive atmosphere lightened slightly, but the forest remained unnaturally silent. As they packed up camp, James noticed something that froze him in place. Just beyond their protective circle, pressed into the soft earth, were footprints. Human footprints, or almost human. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced, and they were massive, at least size 18, possibly larger. The prints circled their entire camp, sometimes close enough that whoever made them could have reached across the barrier and touched them. It had been there all night, walking around them, testing their protections. We need to find Evelyn today, James said. We can't spend another night out here. Tommy nodded. There's a place, old ceremonial ground about 2 miles northeast. It's been forbidden for generations. If it took her anywhere, it would be there. They moved out following Tommy's lead. The forest seemed to resist them, thorny bushes that didn't belong in this ecosystem blocking their path, the ground becoming treacherous with hidden holes and loose rocks. James fell twice, twisting his ankle the second time. The forest itself was fighting them. After 3 hours of difficult hiking, they heard it. A voice, singing, not in English, not in any language James recognized, but the melody was hypnotic, beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. The voice was female. Evelyn, Raymond whispered. They approached carefully, and the trees opened into another clearing. This one was different, ancient. Massive stones stood in a circle covered in pictographs that looked like they predated the Navajo, predated any current Native American culture. The symbols were alien, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than James's eyes could process. In the center of the stone circle, Evelyn knelt. She was alive, her body seemingly unharmed, but her eyes were wrong. The whites had turned gray and her pupils were too large, dilated to the point where almost no iris showed. She was naked, her skin covered in the same symbols that marked the stones, drawn in what looked like ash and blood. She was the one singing. "Evelyn!" James called out, starting forward, but Tommy grabbed him. "Wait! Look!" The shadows around the stones were moving independently of the sunlight. They coiled and writhed like living things, and as James watched, they began to take shape. Human shapes, but wrong, distorted. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all around the clearing. "The dead," Joseph whispered. "Those it's claimed over the years. This is where they're trapped, in the space between worlds." Evelyn's song changed, became discordant, painful to hear. Her mouth opened wider than should be possible, and the voice that emerged was layered. Her voice, yes, but underneath it, something else. Something ancient and cruel. "You came," the voice said, and Evelyn's head turned to face them, her neck bent at an impossible angle, nearly 180 degrees. "I knew the rational man would come. Logic demands answers. Logic demands investigation. And so you investigated your way directly to me." James's blood turned to ice. It wasn't speaking through Evelyn. It was Evelyn, or what she was becoming. "We want to help her," James said. his voice steadier than he felt. Evelyn laughed, and the sound made the stones vibrate. Help? You want to restore what was? Too late. I looked upon the Yi Naldlushi with full understanding. I saw what it offered. Freedom from the prison of singular existence. You live in one world trapped by flesh and time. But there are other worlds, James Martinez. Worlds that exist alongside yours. Worlds you pass through without seeing. I see them all now. I exist in them all. She stood, and her movements were fluid, yet wrong, like something puppeteering a human body without quite understanding how joints worked. She invited it, Tommy said with dawning horror. She didn't stumble across it. She came here looking for it. I'm a botanist, Evelyn said, her gray eyes focusing on each of them in turn. I study life. But Western science is so limited, so blind to the deeper patterns. I read about the old places, the thin places. I read about entities that exist outside conventional biology, and I wanted to see. I wanted to know. So I came here, to the boundary, and I called to it. And it answered. Evelyn, whatever you think you've gained, it's not worth your humanity, James pleaded, even as he knew his words were futile. Humanity. She tilted her head, bird-like. What is humanity but a cage? You feel it, don't you, James? You felt it the moment you saw it. Your rational mind trying to categorize, to explain, to fit the impossible into your limited paradigm. But it doesn't fit. It never fit. Your science is a child's toy compared to what I understand now. The shadows around the stones grew darker, more defined. James could see faces in them now, twisted in eternal agony. The transformation isn't complete yet, Tommy said quietly to James. There might be. Evelyn's laugh cut him off. Oh, Tommy Begay, grandson of John Begay. Yes, I know you. The medicine man's legacy, carrying his little stones and pollen. Do you think those trinkets will protect you here? In this place where the walls are already broken? She raised her arms, and the shadows surged forward. Run! Tommy shouted. They bolted from the clearing, the shadows pursuing them like a living tide. James's twisted ankle screamed with every step, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Behind them, Evelyn's voice rose in that terrible song, and the forest itself seemed to respond, branches reaching out to snag clothing and scratch exposed skin. Joseph fell, and before anyone could reach him, the shadows were on him. His scream was cut short, replaced by a wet, tearing sound. James didn't look back, couldn't look back. Rational thought had abandoned him. Pure survival instinct drove him forward. They burst out of the tree line onto a rocky outcropping. Tommy immediately began drawing symbols on the stone with his corn pollen, working frantically. Raymond helped, both men moving with practiced urgency. This won't hold long, Tommy gasped, but it might give us enough time. Time for what? James demanded. To complete the reversal ritual. It's dangerous, forbidden, but it's the only way. We need to sever her connection to the spirit world, pull her consciousness back fully to the physical. But to do that, someone has to go back, has to make direct eye contact with what she's becoming, and hold that connection while the ritual is performed. That's suicide, Raymond said flatly. Yes, Tommy agreed. It probably is. But it's the only way to stop this. If her transformation completes, she'll become like the thing that took her. Another predator in these woods, another entity feeding on the lost and the curious. And the dead will pile up year after year until... A sound interrupted him, singing, getting closer. Evelyn was coming. James's mind raced. 15 years of logical problem solving, and none of it had prepared him for this moment. But underneath the panic, underneath the terror, his analytical mind still worked, still processed. If someone had to maintain eye contact, had to create a connection, they needed someone whose mind was trained to observe, to analyze, to not look away even when every instinct screamed to do so. They needed someone rational. I'll do it, James heard himself say. James, you don't understand what you're... I understand, James cut Tommy off. You need someone who can look at the impossible and not break immediately. You need someone trained to process trauma without shutting down. That's my job. That's what I do. Tommy's expression was anguished. If this works, if we pull her back, you might not survive the connection. Whatever you see in there, in the space between worlds, it might fracture your mind permanently. Then you'd better work fast. James tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. The singing was very close now. Evelyn emerged from the trees, but she wasn't alone. The shadow shapes surrounded her, and behind them, towering over the canopy, was the Yi Naldlushi itself. In daylight, it was even more terrible. A void in the shape of something that mocked the human form, its presence seeming to drain color and warmth from the air itself. Tommy and Raymond began to chant, their voices harmonizing in words James didn't understand. They drew more symbols, complex geometric patterns that seemed to shimmer and shift even as James watched them. James Martinez, Evelyn said, her voice now completely overtaken by something else. The rational man. Did you solve the mystery? Did you find your answers? James forced himself to meet her eyes. The gray had deepened to black, and in those depths he saw worlds upon worlds, realities stacked like cards, and he was falling through them, seeing with senses he didn't have, understanding concepts that had no names in human language. He saw the spirit world, vast and terrible, populated by entities that had existed since before humanity crawled from the primordial ooze. He saw how thin the barriers were, how fragile the walls that kept those ancient things from bleeding into reality. He saw what Evelyn had seen, the seductive promise of transcendence, of existence beyond the limited scope of human perception. His nose began to bleed. The pain in his head was excruciating, like his skull was being pried open from the inside. But he held her gaze, held the connection, because Tommy and Raymond were chanting faster now, their ritual reaching a crescendo. In the space between heartbeats, James saw Evelyn, the real Evelyn, trapped inside the transformation, screaming silently, a prisoner in her own transfigured flesh. She hadn't understood what she was inviting in. The knowledge had seemed worth the price until she paid it. The Yi Naldlushi moved forward, and its attention fixed on James. The weight of that regard nearly crushed him. He felt it in his mind, probing, tasting, curious about this rational man who dared to look upon it directly. It showed him things, his death in 1,000 variations, his wife's death, the deaths of everyone he loved. Not threats, just observations. These things would happen eventually. Time was a circle, death was inevitable, flesh was temporary, but so was suffering. And the creature fed on suffering like normal beings fed on food. No! Tommy's voice cut through the visions. The ritual symbols flared with brilliant white light, and James felt the connection snap. Evelyn screamed, a purely human sound this time, and collapsed. The shadows retreated, and the Yi Naldlushi didn't disappear, but pulled back, fading into the spaces between the trees, retreating to whatever dimension it primarily inhabited. James fell to his knees, blood pouring from his nose and ears. His mind felt scraped raw, like he'd stared into the sun for too long, but on a metaphysical level. Tommy and Raymond rushed to him, but he waved them toward Evelyn. She was alive. Human. The gray had faded from her eyes, leaving them their natural brown. The symbols on her skin were just ash and blood now, no longer glowing with otherworldly power. She was sobbing, curled into a fetal position. "Get her up," James croaked. "We need to move. It's not gone, just waiting." They fashioned a stretcher from branches and their jackets and began the long trek back to base camp. James's mind felt distant, disconnected. He kept seeing double, the normal world overlaid with hints of that other place, that spirit realm. Tommy had been right. The connection had damaged him. Evelyn drifted in and out of consciousness, and when she was awake, she wouldn't speak, just stared at nothing with haunted eyes. They reached base camp as the sun was setting. Paramedics rushed forward to take Evelyn. The official story would be that she'd been lost, disoriented, suffering from exposure and dehydration. James would file a report that left out everything that mattered. Joseph's death would be attributed to a fall, his body eventually found, torn apart by wildlife. As they loaded Evelyn into the helicopter, she grabbed James's hand. Her eyes cleared for just a moment. "I saw God," she whispered. "Or what we call God. But it wasn't benevolent, James. It was just vast. And so hungry. We're all just food to things like that. Fleeting moments of consciousness in an uncaring universe." Then she was gone, lifted away into the darkening sky. Tommy drove James back to Flagstaff in silence. As they reached the edge of the forest, James looked back at the tree line. In the shadows between the pines, something tall and dark stood watching. Even from a distance, he could feel its eyes. "Will it come after me?" James asked. "You broke the connection before it was complete. You'll have nightmares, probably for the rest of your life. You'll see things in your peripheral vision that aren't there, or are there, just in the other world, bleeding through. But you didn't look at it long enough for it to fully claim you. You're scarred, but not owned." Small comfort. When James finally got home, Maria took one look at him and started crying. "What happened to you?" James wanted to tell her everything, to share the burden of what he'd seen, but how could he? How could he explain that reality was thinner than she imagined, that monsters were real, that her rational, logical husband had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back? "Bad case," he finally said. "Found her alive. Lost a good man." Maria held him while he shook, and James stared at the wall, seeing shapes in the shadows that his rational mind insisted weren't there. He submitted his resignation to the Park Service the next week. He couldn't do that job anymore, couldn't walk into forests without feeling that weight of otherworldly attention. He took a desk job, something safe, something far from the wild places where the walls grew thin. But late at night, when sleep finally claimed him, James dreamed of singing in languages that predated humanity, of spaces folded in on themselves, of eyes, so many eyes, watching from just beyond the veil of reality. And sometimes just before waking, he heard Evelyn's voice echoing in his memory. "We're all just food." His rational mind had survived intact mostly. He could still analyze, still problem solve, still think logically. But underneath that rationality now lived a terrible knowledge. Logic only worked within the boundaries of a single reality, and those boundaries were far more permeable than humanity wanted to believe. James Martinez had found his answers. And like Evelyn, he learned that some questions should never be asked. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?